If you look at old images of Königsberg before the war, a common focal point is an imposing Gothic bell tower reminiscent of the Old Town Tower on Karlsbridge in Prague. It was part of the most recognizable building in all of the city, Königsberg Castle. At least, it was until Allied bombing campaigns left it largely in ruins. After the city's transformation into Kaliningrad, Soviet authorities had little interest in restoring an edifice which symbolized not only the recently defeated Germans, but also the eternal enemy of the communist revolution, the bourgeois imperialists. The lack of desire to do so was just as well, as the necessary resources were also severely lacking. For these reasons, it was not a hard decision for them to level the remains of the castle and in its prominent position overlooking the Pregola River and city below, to erect an architectural behemoth which would represent the might and grandeur of the USSR. That project was Dom Sovetov, the House of Soviets. But, as can easily be seen in the current state of the building, something, somewhere along the way, did not go as planned. In the case of Dom Sovetov, there were multiple factors, but before we explore what went wrong, let's see what should have been. Originally, in the years immediately after World War II, plans were to build another Stalinist Vysotka, like the Seven Sisters in Moscow or the Palace of Culture and Science in Warsaw. However, no progress was made in this direction, and although some Soviet citizens even began to send letters to the government petitioning for the castle to be restored, it was instead demolished bit by bit until the final section came down in 1968 under personal orders from Brezhnev. Up until this time, however, there was no unified vision for what would fill this space. So in 1967, a new plan for the area was drawn up in the leading architectural style of those years. The plan called for a large public territory with cascading fountains and paved squares at the base of two rectangular towers, each with 28 floors, interconnected by two sets of skywalks. The local Politburo members pushed for construction, claiming it was absolutely necessary as the building they were using for local government functions was unsuitable. Fun fact, that same building is still in use by the city government to this day. Construction on the House of Soviets began in 1970, but it wasn't long until changes were made to the project. Mainly that the height of the towers was cut by a quarter, from 28 floors down to 21. There are conflicting views as to why this happened, with many keen to believe the theory that the ground just wasn't solid enough to support such a massive structure, as was often the case with many of the Soviet Union's most grandiose architectural visions. The problem in Kaliningrad was that the construction was being done on top of the former castle's foundations, which in turn were set in rather marshy ground. However, in reality, the foundations that were laid for Dom Sovetov were quite solid and could theoretically have handled a building significantly taller. No, the reason behind the downsizing was much more banal: finances. During Perestroika, there simply wasn't enough money in the budget to provide for those additional stories, so they got the axe. Still, despite financial difficulties, construction continued, and by the early 90s, the project was 95% finished, with the northern tower fully completed, including elevators, and the southern tower only lacking wallpaper. Another year was all that was necessary to put the finishing touches on the House of Soviets, but the collapse of the Soviet Union brought all plans to a halt. In the years following that event, the building technically didn't have an owner until in 1995 it was privatized. The city government created an organization which was supposed to be responsible for attracting businesses and investors to finish out and take up residency in Dom Sovetov. However, this organization went bankrupt in 2003, and the building was sold to Proststroy, a company from Moscow which invested some $7 million into repairing the House of Soviets, which had stood abandoned for over a decade. In 2004, however, the financial details behind the transfer were made public, and the Kaliningrad city government took Proststroy to court, alleging that the legal interests of the city and oblast had been undermined in the deal. The building sold for $7 per square meter when the average price in the city center could reach highs of $300 per square meter. Notwithstanding the legal proceedings, the building didn't fall into disrepair yet again, as in 2005, for the 750th anniversary of Königsberg, the exterior of the House of Soviets was painted and windows were installed, to give the structure a look more befitting the festivities. Beyond that, though, Dom Sovetov would receive no other care or attention. In 2010, the courts ruled the original 2000 Sale 3 null and void, with the city government eventually obtaining 15% ownership control, which was later handed over to the oblast. Recently, a number of plans were put forth as to what to do with the building and territory. According to estimates put forth in 2017, the cost of renovating the House of Soviets and making it usable would be approximately 450 million to 1.2 billion rubles, or $5 to $13.5 million. Unfortunately, investors could not be found, and the government took back control of the building. According to the governor of the oblast, Anton Alikhanov, they initially believed that they could finish the building, but it had stood, interiors exposed to the elements, for too long to realistically save the structure. Moreover, due to numerous factors within the building, such as ceiling heights and stair designs that had been made during the Soviet Union and did not meet modern building codes, the House of Soviets would be unusable. In the end, the decision was made to take the building apart. Although the dismantling process began this year, it's still unclear what exactly will fill the void left behind. Even the city is unsure. A recent design competition found the jury unable to crown a victor among the many submissions. They opted for 2 second-place finishers instead. The designs are certainly creative, one with a multitude of geometric buildings and another that pays homage to the original castle's tower, but none of them feel right for the spot. None of them have that special something. In the end, the winning project will likely be multifunctional mixed real estate, a soulless set of buildings with uninspired design that would be indistinguishable from any such project on the edges of Moscow, the cookie-cutter approach to modern Russian architecture that awes upon first encounter but quickly loses its appeal with every repetitive iteration one meets. The long-term neglect of Dom Sovetov and the eventual, yet sadly necessary decision to dismantle the iconic building is a perfect example of a trend repeated numerous times throughout Russia and the former Soviet Union. When the system fell apart, many custodians of state power were more interested in lining their pockets and accumulating political clout than they were in ensuring the well-being of the people, institutions, and regions they were entrusted with. It's a story repeated across every metropolitan area here in Russia, including Moscow. Yet instead of the state investing the required resources into projects such as the House of Soviets, which would have become a common space around a symbol already adopted by the residents, money and effort has been spent on patriotic PR projects, like memorial plaques to deceased former politicians or yet more World War II statues, as though it's possible to go all of 5 minutes in Russia without being reminded of it. The House of Soviets might not have been the most beautifully designed building, but its distinctive Soviet modernist style was not interested in navel-gazing at the feats and accomplishments of yesteryear, but instead looked forward to what people might yet achieve in the innumerable years ahead. For that reason, the peculiar facade of Dom Sovetov is perfect, a pareidolik illusion of a robotic face staring over the heart of the old city, taking stock of all Königsberg had been and peering beyond into an ideological future.